So welcome, everybody. So you seem to be the one who are not afraid of winter storms, if at least there is one. So this is the first event of this lab on humans and in the digital economy. It's part of the Digital Future Initiative at the business school. So this is a new think tank that Kostis Makloras founded a couple of months ago. And it's really focused on preparing our students for like what is going to be the digital future going to be about, and also help kind of organizations, governments, and community better understand, leverage kind of what this next disruption is going to be like. This is in collaboration with another center in the school, the Paul Milstein Center of Real Estate, who organizes all our amazing real estate program, all the classes supports, all the research that has to do with real estate. Now, to introduce the topic is not that hard, but I try to do it slightly different than you might expect. So, quoting somebody who is hardly ever quoted in a business school, this is Lenin. So he said there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. So he meant it about the Bolshevik Revolution, but I think it equally applies kind of to what COVID did to a lot of trends in the world, and particularly how to think about the workplace. When you look at those trends, where like before the pandemic, there were 5% work days were at home, and after the pandemic, it's about 30 days, and I think it's probably going to stay like that, but maybe we're going to talk about that. So the new normal is that people are not coming into the office as much, and that, of course, has consequences of how we manage firms, but it also will have consequences on real estate and cities in particular. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today with an amazing panel. So let me introduce the three speakers. The fourth one, Donnell, actually was asked to go to DC to see Congressman Jeffries. I'm a little upset that he thinks Congressman Jeffries is more important than I am, but anyway, he's not here. So to my left, or to your right, is Stijn van Niederburg. He's originally from Belgium, but I consider him a New Yorker. So he has been at Columbia for 5 years and has been at NYU another 15 years. So since his PhD in Stanford, he has only been in New York. Is that correct? So his professional career after his PhD has been in New York. He studies extensively on real estate in general, but more recently about how COVID and the hybrid work actually affects real estate prices in general. He's in the news a lot, so I heard that people call him Professor Doom. Now, despite the fact that he lives with his family in New York and comes to the office 5 days a week, he predicts that cities are going to have a hard time. So we're going to hear from him first. Next to Stijn is Julie Stein. She is the executive director of the new New York panel. So the Governor Hochul and Mayor Adams constituted this panel work task force to think about what's going to happen to the business district in New York. She then worked with that 60-person panel to actually think about much more holistically about what to do with cities. And this 40-point plan that they came up with, was described as the most ambitious document to address the urban crisis brought on by the pandemic. And so I'm really looking forward to her. She's the only one on the panel here who doesn't have a degree or works at Columbia. She comes from, she has degrees from MIT and Brown, but she's still welcome here on campus. And then, last but not least, there is Nick Binstock. He has, since he graduated from Columbia, worked in the real estate business ever since. He's also an adjunct at the school here and heavily involved in the real estate program at the school. At the moment, he is a managing partner at Savannah. There he sits on the investment committee and is responsible for sourcing, asset management, acquisition, as well as supervising of the ongoing marketing and leasing of the whole Savannah's investment portfolio. So it's going to be interesting to see here what's happening on the ground. Now, we all agree that we want to keep this very discussion based, but I'm going to start just with everybody giving kind of their first introductory remarks to set the stage. And I think I'm going to start with Stein, to give us, what does the research, what does Professor Doom tell us about the real estate market in general in urban areas and in New York in particular?
Thank you, Stefan. Welcome, everyone. Great to see so many of you here. So let me start with some introductory remarks, mostly based on some of the research I've been working on the last couple of years. And I like the way Stefan sort of framed the issue, because I do think we're sort of living in the middle of what's really a remarkable transformation, really a revolution. Lenin might not be sort of too far off here, in the sense that, this idea of separation of location of work from location of residence is really a transformational idea in my mind, and something that's going to take sort of decades to play out. And we're sort of at the very start of that in my mind. And so that is sort of a big idea, because if you think about it, for thousands of years, people have been, working where they're living. They were, living near the forests that they were foraging. They were living near the farms that they were working on, near the lands that they worked in later after the Industrial Revolution. And then sort of more recently, they were either living close to their office or sort of within commuting distance from their offices. And all of that is sort of getting potentially disrupted now with the separation of location of work and location of residence. And that's kind of happening, and that's happening on a global scale. So that's sort of a mind-blowing idea in my mind, and one which I think is going to have important repercussions for real estate and urban structure. So I want to begin by sort of bringing you back 3 years to the start of the pandemic and talking a little bit about sort of the effect on migration and residential real estate. Right, so you remember 3 years ago, almost to the date, right? A lot of people left big cities, sort of escaping the health risks that COVID brought. And there were sort of two types of migration. One type of migration was within metropolitan areas, where people were moving from the urban core to the suburbs. Think of sort of people moving from Manhattan to, Westchester County, or maybe even to Brooklyn. Okay, just sort of in search of a little bit more space, a little bit more sort of healthy environment. The second migration wave was smaller, but nevertheless also important, and that was from large cities to smaller cities. Think of it as from New York City, from the New York metropolitan area, a lot of it to the Sun Belt, to places like, in Florida, in Phoenix, in Arizona. Sort of that whole south of the U.S. is attracted, and especially smaller cities in the south have attracted a lot of population from large cities. And just to give you a couple of numbers, Manhattan lost 200,000 residents since March of 2020, which is that's the most of any county in the United States. If you add Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens, New York City lost 350,000 residents. Right, that's a big number. Now, how do we know this? We know this from lots of new data, cell phone ping data. Whenever you go somewhere, Google captures you. And so we can sort of track people. We also know that from United States Postal Service change of address data, for example. And this migration was much stronger for people who were able to work remotely, so mostly like professionals, like many of you. And also people that sort of had the means of moving, right? So the economic means of moving to rent another place, maybe buy a house. Now, what was the effect on residential real estate? Well, it was very clear. Demand for real estate went up in the suburbs and in the smaller cities. That pushed up prices because in the short run, supply was essentially fixed. And we sort of saw this large change in urban relative to suburban house prices and house rents, right? So that's sort of a first stylized fact. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the office market. So the office market is sort of ground zero for remote work, right? And it is an important asset class because it sits in a lot of institutional portfolios, a lot of commercial real estate. The average institution allocates about 10% to commercial real estate. Of that, a lot of it is office. And so that sort of has aggregate implications as well. And it's important for not just for equity investors, but also for debt investors, for banks, investors in commercial mortgage-backed securities. And it's important for local governments, and we'll talk a lot more about that, but basically local property tax revenue is an important source of tax revenue for local municipalities. Right, so, in this paper that I wrote, which is somewhat ominously titled The Office Real Estate Apocalypse, I guess I deserve my title. In a nutshell, what we do is we sort of document what has already happened in the last 2.5 years to rents in the office market. And in particular, what we find is that sort of the leasing revenue from existing office buildings has fallen about 20% already at this point. What we also notice is that a lot, and many of you who work in real estate will notice, leases are long-term in nature. The average lease in New York City is 7.5 years. Okay, there's some leases that are 10 and 20 years. And so what that means is that a lot of leases have not come up. A lot of leases that were outstanding just prior to the onset of COVID are still with us today because they have not come up for renewal yet. In fact, only about a third, 36% to be precise, of leases outstanding in December 2019 have actually come up for renewal in 2020, 2021, or 2022. Okay, what that means is that, sort of as bad as the drop in leasing revenue has already been, the second shoe is yet to fall because there's all these leases that are still outstanding. And moreover, some of the leases that were coming up for renewal in those 3 years actually were renewed for a very short amount of time, 2 years, 3 years. So we see a large increase in the share of short-term office leases. Okay, so we sort of have a lot of risk going forward, lease renewal risk in the next several years. Right, so now what that means is that, so what we do see is that sort of new leasing activity is very, very slow. Right, so sort of every quarter a fraction of leases rolls off because they're up for renewal, and then the question is, what fraction is getting released? And what we see is that new leasing activity has fallen by anywhere between 50 and 80% across cities in the United States. Right, so for New York City, that number is 54%. For San Francisco, 70% drop. 70% drop in new leasing activity, okay, on an annual basis. So what that means is that with sort of a lot of new leases rolling off and not being renewed, the contractual vacancy rate is going up. Occupancy is falling. And so occupancy levels are now at the lowest that they have been in 30 plus years. Okay, so in San Francisco, the contractual occupancy rate right now is something like 75%, so 25% vacancy. In New York City, 23% vacancy, highest since the beginning of sort of modern data. So what we do in our paper is we then sort of ask, what do these leasing trends imply for the value, for the value of office assets? So we're sort of coming up with a model to value office, okay? And so long story short, what we find is that sort of the aggregates, and we do most of our work for New York City, that the aggregate value of all office in New York City, to the best of our ability, has fallen by about 40%. Okay, so that's sort of our headline number, 40% drop in office values. Now, I don't want you to say it's exactly 40%. I want you to think of this as 40% with a lot of risk around it. There's sort of a whole distribution around that 40% number because who knows? We might be going back to the office or we might be stuck in remote work for the next 10 years. Right, sort of depending on what happens, maybe it's less than 40%, maybe it's more than 40%. And so sort of our model gives you a tool for thinking about the risk of that. The other important thing that comes out of that analysis is that there's really sort of a tale of two markets. There's the A+ market, as we call it, sort of the best quality, most amenitized newest office buildings. They're doing considerably better than the older product, the Class B, the Class C office, which I really think of as a stranded asset. So if you combine higher interest rates, climate regulation, remote work, that really is sort of a triple headwind for Class B and Class C office. And in my mind, that sort of makes that the value of those assets essentially, I don't want to be too dramatic, but close to zero, close to the value of the land, okay? So that's sort of this idea of flight to quality. And then, so the last thing I will say is that we can come back to these points if you like. Big tech was a big supporter of office demand in 2020 and 2021 and sort of bailed out the market at least a little bit. That has now fallen away. Facebook, Google, and so forth have sort of withdrawn from the market. They're giving up office space. They're actually taking huge write-downs, accounting write-downs to get out of their leases. And they're firing people, right? So sort of as the economy is heading into recession, one of the easiest ways for CFOs to save cost is to just, not renew an office lease or renew it for half the amount of space than the old lease, right? So, as long as people are not dramatically less productive working from home, it costs money to put them in an office, and it's really low-hanging fruit to cut expenses. And even companies that are doing well, that are making money, are in the process of basically rationalizing their office footprint, and we're seeing this sort of play out right now, sort of in spades. Just sort of looking beyond office, urban retail is sort of in the same boat as urban office. It's doing just as poorly. If you look at leases, leasing revenue, net effective rent, all the trends are the same, even quantitatively for urban retail as they are for urban office. And so, I'll stop here, but there's sort of a whole debate that we'll have on what does all of this mean for cities and for sort of property tax revenue and so forth. But we'll come back to that later.
It gets worse.
That's the urban doom loop. I haven't talked about the urban doom loop yet.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So before we go to Julie, let's go to Nick. And so what do you see kind of on the ground? You're like in that business and you deal with it day in and day out for the last many, many years, including through the pandemic. So Nick, what do you see on the ground that from your experience?
So I would say I agree with many of the things that have been said. I don't think kind of the Dr. Doom philosophy, having lived through multiple severe crises and managed our portfolios through multiple crises in New York. I came of age in 1989 in real estate, doing workouts. There was a crisis in national real estate that hit New York at that time. The Asian debt crisis hit New York in 1998. In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst and melted down and hit Earth in 2001, 9/11. The global financial crisis, 2008, 9, 10, Hurricane Sandy, 2015, and then COVID. I think New York does have a remarkable capacity across multiple crises of different types to recover. That being said, I actually agree with a lot of the things that you've said. I think some of these issues are different than some of the issues that we've dealt with in the past. To kind of wind back and kind of look at the last 3 years, obviously everyone remembers New York was in the heart of the pandemic for a period of time. Everything shut down, leasing shut down, construction shut down, and the market went through a really sort of tough period. At that time, I think there was an expectation in the business, on the business side of the business, that we were going to go into a default cycle, right? I thought, and we were one of the most active players in the city of New York in following the global financial crisis in debt to equity plays, where we went in and we bought defaulted mezzanine loans and first mortgages and worked our way to the equity. At that time, we acquired about 4 million square feet of real estate through debt to equity strategies. A lot of people, like folks like Savannah, were thinking the same thing's going to happen in this cycle, and it really didn't. Now, why didn't it? I think there were a couple of reasons. One, that time the financial institutions were the problem. The financial institutions were in distress. The Fed was pushing financial institutions to get bad assets off their balance sheet and to recapitalize. And this time the financial institutions were in pretty good health. And they didn't need to do that. And in fact, they looked at their portfolios and said, when we did that back then, we transferred a lot of wealth to people on the other side of the table. Let's not make that same mistake. This is a pandemic. We're going to come out of it at a certain point in time. And sure enough, by 2001, that seemed to be happening. People came back to the city. Restaurants started to get full. Leasing started to pick up. And all the metrics, if you look at it, every graph was going in the right direction. Occupancy was coming back. By the end of 2001, I think, if you look at leasing averages, we were back to normalized leasing averages in terms of per square foot leased, if you look back across time. So the market at the end of 2001 was absolutely in a recovery mode. Nobody expected that then there was going to be a capital markets crisis. And so we went into 2022, and all of a sudden interest rates spiked, more than doubled, and that led to another blow to capital stacks that were already precarious. And that has continued, and it's gotten worse over the course of this year. And as we go into 2023, I think we're going into a default cycle now. We're going to a cycle where every day, if you pick up the paper, Brookfield is giving assets back, RXR is giving assets back, Vornado is, Blackstone, the biggest, baddest players in the industry are, literally handing assets back to their lenders. So I think we're going into a period which is going to be a distress period in the next 12 to 24 months. And I think that's going to create kind of distress across particular assets, but it's not evenly distributed. As you said, what is clear in the post-COVID world is that better assets in better locations closer to transportation are doing relatively well, and secondary assets in secondary locations that need work on their air handling systems and don't have the kinds of amenities that tenants are looking for are suffering, are disproportionately suffering. So we have a portfolio today of about 7 million square feet in New York. Our assets in and around Grand Central, Penn Station, on top of transportation that are improved are doing pretty well. We're leasing, I think we've done almost 2 million square feet of leases this year. And we're probably 12% off our original pro forma. But the market rents in general across the market are down 30%. Market rents, and I think CB Richard Ellis just came up with a study that looked at better assets in better locations, and they're only down about 12 or 13%. So the pain is not evenly distributed, it's unequally distributed. And as we look forward, we see that continuing. Businesses are making money, businesses are doing well. A lot of people want to bring their people back to work, generally Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And when they want people back to work, they want them all back to work. They want them all back to work at the same time so that they can have the kind of collaborative relationships that are so important to so many businesses. So in a weird way, I think the occupancy statistic that we're sort of average occupancy is less relevant today. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are back to close to, in many of our buildings, close to pre-pandemic levels. Monday is lighter and Friday is empty. So you almost need an occupancy statistic that's what's relevant, is do people still need to work together? And if they have to work together, they want to work together at the same time. So people are coming back at the same time. And as we design spaces for tenants, we're designing it to reflect that. So there's more open spaces, there's more conference rooms, more collaborative spaces, less individual office spaces. Because again, when people are bringing their employees back, everyone has incorporated a remote component to work, a work from home component. But when they're back, they want people to be together and intermingle it. So I would say I agree with a lot of what you said in terms of what's happened in the market. I think we are going into a tough period and a default cycle period in the next 12 to 24 months. The only other thing I would say is with respect to the out-migration, we started a business in Southern Florida. We expanded our business to Southern Florida 3 years ago. And I was there yesterday. It's booming. It is booming. People are in a good mood. The business is great. They're signing leases, they're selling apartments, and what you're seeing, you read it in the high-level statistics, but people are leaving for favorable climate. They're going for a more favorable tax environment, a more welcoming business environment, and it's a lot of, and you're seeing a lot of people leave from New York. Like we're building a 1.6 million square foot condominium in West Palm Beach, facing Palm Beach. So big project. And so we're marketing everywhere. We launched marketing about a month ago. Where are the buyers coming from? We've hired Douglas Elliman, they're marketing. New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, first and foremost. And after that, California, right? They're coming often from higher tax, higher regulated jurisdictions, and they're moving there. Now, not everyone is moving permanently, but I'm seeing lots and lots of people I know are moving. They're buying a place, they are opening a satellite office, and part of it is technology. Part of it's that we're all so comfortable today with now Zoom technology that I can go down, I can spend 2 days a week working down there, we have an office down there, and not skip a beat, right? So Zoom technology has allowed people a greater level of flexibility in their lives and the way they live and the way they work. And that has inure to the benefit of a lot of these secondary, what used to be secondary locations, that are drawing away some of the, frankly, some of the wealth and talent of New York. I'll just say one more thing before. West Palm Beach is building today 1.8 million square feet of office space. And they're drawing a lot of firms down there. And in Miami, they made an announcement recently, Blackstone is moving to Miami. 40,000 square feet. Doesn't matter. It barely, I mean, it doesn't even move the needle in New York. The mayor of Miami came up to New York a couple of months ago, and Greenberg Traurig is a law firm. We do a lot of business with them. The mayor of Miami came up and he wanted to meet some people in the real estate business in New York, and so they set up a meeting. And I met a guy named Suarez, very charismatic, and he came in the room and he said, look, I'm gonna keep taxes low, I'm gonna keep the city safe, I'm trying to encourage business, I'm here to encourage you guys to come down and do business in Miami. And he was very persuasive and straightforward guy. And at the end of the meeting, I said, Mayor Suarez, if JP Morgan needs 500,000 square feet and they want to hire 5,000 people, can you accommodate that? And the answer was basically no. Like, yes, they can accommodate Blackstone opening an office for 40,000 square feet, but the infrastructure of global business exists in New York, and it exists, and the talent pool exists on a scale and to a degree that no other place in the United States has it. We negotiated the lease a couple of years ago. It's a sad story. Amazon was going to occupy our building in Long Island City as their headquarters. We spent a year with the Amazon guys, like, negotiating that lease. They were not coming to New York because they particularly wanted to come to New York. It's expensive, you know, it's not so easy to do business. They were coming here because the talent pool was here, because they could hire 50,000 smart people, and we had the infrastructure to accommodate them. So I think both, you know, you can have opposite sides of the same coin. You can have some of these southern markets thrive and pull some businesses in, but at the end of the day, it's around the margins. The major companies of the world who need the incredible talent pool and infrastructure here that we have, I think almost have to be here, need to be here. And just I have two kids who just graduated from college. Every single one of their friends wants to come to New York. They came to New York, they're coming to New York, everyone wants to be here. Literally not one, like one of them had to go to Chicago and was trying to transfer to New York. So I think it's that, ultimately that's the saving grace of this city. I think people want to live here, I think they want to work here, and I think the city is and will come back, but I think it's going to be a bumpy road for the next couple of years.
Thanks. So what I hear is, like, on one hand, you know, there is this very challenging situation, but also there is an asset, you know, that there is something about the city, and I think that's what Julie and the task force kind of did to figure out, and you just told me in 6 months? 6 months. From start to end, came up with like a 40-point plan. So Julie, what is it that, like, will save our love it New York City?
Thank you for setting up my part of this so well, because I think you've done a really nice job both sort of laying out the challenges and also the opportunity. I mean, one thing I'll say before I dive in is that, you know, there used to be a model where, you know, people would move to where the businesses are. Now businesses move to where the people are. And so cultivating talent is really where it's at, and being a place where talent wants to be is sort of the magic sauce. And we have that here. So I'm going to run down what we have been up to. So as this story has been told, you know, the pandemic has obviously changed everything: how we work, how we live, how we play. And as a result, these new trends that you so nicely laid out for us have been introduced to the city. It's about changing expectations of how and where people work, how many days in the week employees and employers expect people to be in the office, which has huge impacts on office space, as you laid out, but also, of course, the commercial ecosystems that in our business districts that have traditionally revolved around those office workers. And that has huge potential implications on our tax revenue, because business districts in New York and elsewhere are the fiscal foundations that all municipalities run off of. And that revenue from those business districts powers government spending on social infrastructure, on physical infrastructure. So even if you yourself don't work in Midtown, don't work in downtown, you need to care about what's happening there, because your library, your senior center, your education, your roads, all that stuff is funded by this center of global commerce that's happening in Midtown. We also know that the trends from the pandemic exacerbated existing inequalities. This is true from the health outcomes of the pandemic itself, and also in terms of the employment recovery that we've seen. So, the jobs in New York City are still down from 2019 levels. This is especially true in sectors where low-income workers are primarily employed, like food and beverage. We also know that unemployment is up. That is particularly true for Black and Brown New Yorkers. And this is sort of the starting point that we started our work at the New York panel. I also want to say there are positive trends that we are seeing, so that's important context. New York City private sector added 20,000 private sector jobs in December alone. That's capping 11 months of consecutive months of job growth, which is good. And since Mayor Adams started in January of 2022, we've seen an additional 199,000 jobs added in New York City. So, nothing to sneeze at. We also know, and this is a really interesting stat, that new business formation is happening like crazy in New York City. There have been 32,000 new businesses that have been formed in the last year. 1 in 9 businesses in New York City has been formed within the last year, which is a fascinating statistic. So, 2022 has been a sort of a banner year for us because people want to be here. This, I think the context that you've laid out, and actually the point that you made when you started, is that New York City's success over time has really been our ability to convert crisis into opportunity. You gave, 15 examples probably, but I think one of the ways that this city distinguishes itself from other places is our ability to bounce back. And Mayor Eric Adams and Governor Kathy Hochul saw a similar opportunity in this moment, post-pandemic, and tasked us, the New York panel, with reimagining what a new New York could look like. And so in June of 2022, we brought together 59 civic leaders, industry experts, to be on a blue ribbon panel that was chaired by 2 former deputy mayors, Dan Doctoroff and Richard Beery. And they came together, and the goal was to leverage this sort of, I don't know how much you guys know about city-state politics, but you leverage this pretty unique moment in city-state mayor alignment to build a coordinated joint plan for the recovery and resilience of New York City and the entire interconnected downstate region. The initial charge of the panel was to revive our business districts, but we very quickly realized that we would actually need solutions that address a much wider range of interconnected challenges affecting all New Yorkers. In this world where people can vote with their feet, we really needed to answer the question, why should they work here? Which led us to the conclusion that we needed to make New York the best place to work, no matter what you do or where you work. And to do that, to your point, you really need to make New York the best place, period. And so that was sort of our framework going into our recommendation. So in December, 6 months, as I was saying, 6 months to the day from when we kicked off to when the governor and the mayor announced the recommendations, they're not recommendations, adopted initiatives of the mayor and the governor. In December, we released this 40-point plan that was organized under 3 key goals, which I'll walk through in a minute. But I think to underscore, I just want to make the point that the plan is multidimensional, it is interconnected, it goes beyond traditional economic development levers towards recovery. It acknowledges that there's no single silver bullet, that there are a number of things that we need to do across multiple dimensions in order to make the city the best place to work and the best place, period. And fundamentally, the plan talks about how we need to not just recover, but we need to evolve. We need to make sure that the city is better positioned moving forward into this new world, the stuff we know and the uncertainties that we don't know. So the plan has 40 points. Some of them are legislative changes, some of them are budget, some of them are just agency actions, things that need to be enacted. Some are city, some are state, some are federal. And really what they're all meant to do is be catalytic public actions to induce private investment. And so there's the part that the public sector has to do, but of course there's also the part that the private sector has to do to reinvest in the city, and together we bring the city back. So I'll just run through quickly the sort of 3 goals that span a number of different things, but I think most importantly, it really talks about this interconnection, which you'll see. So our first goal is about reimagining our business districts as 24/7 vibrant destinations. This is about shedding our old ideas about single-use business districts and supporting their evolution into great places where people live, work, and play. in 2023, this may not be rocket science, but it's certainly not the way that Midtown currently functions. It is what was very successful in Lower Manhattan, but it will take a fair amount of change in order to bring that type of success into Midtown. So we identified under this goal 4 interconnected strategies in order to achieve this live, work, play environment. The first one is making sure that our city and state regulatory environment is flexible and conducive to evolution of the land use and the building use, so that it can evolve to this modern context. And that's about making sure that we can bring more residential into our business districts while still keeping them global hubs of centers of commerce, because that is our unique competitive advantage. We also want to make sure that we have updated and common sense regulatory rules that govern the use of our commercial space, because right now, for example, there are certain commercial districts where you can have a restaurant, but you can't have a caterer. You can have a bike repair shop, but not a bike rental shop. There's just all of these arcane things. This is the moment for us to update our regulatory code and get the rules out of the way so we can evolve. And one of the things in this that I'm sure we'll talk more about is the residential conversions, and it's a very hot topic, and I think we were talking about it before the panel started. We want to make sure that when it makes sense and where it makes sense, the rules are out of the way so that we can convert outdated office space to residential use, to both soak up some of that excess vacancy, but also bring more foot traffic into these business districts. And one footnote I want to say to the point you were making about flight to quality is that, yes, we are absolutely seeing a flight to quality and more stranded assets in the lower quality. But I think that it's important to acknowledge the market segmentation that's happening, that there is a flight to quality in Class A, there's a flight to quality in Class B, there's a flight to quality in Class C. And those Class B and Class C office spaces are actually really critical for those sort of like bread and butter New York City businesses, your lawyers, your medical offices. There's a lot of people who actually need that office space. So our prediction is not that you're going to see everyone going into the most modern Class A. You're going to see everyone flight to quality within their class. That market segmentation is key. A second key catalytic investment under this sort of live, work, play framework is about investment in permanent, beautiful public space. So this is your capital improvements to make places more pedestrianized, to make just world-class public space. When you think of Barcelona, you think of Paris. We have some of that here, but not in Midtown. And we want to make sure we're making investments that make them pleasant places. One of our co-chairs at one of our meetings was making the joke that he loves to walk. He loves to walk all over New York City. Never once does he think to walk through Midtown. And that's telling, right? We think that these type of capital improvements will encourage some of the residential that we want to see. It will also make commutes feel safer for people who are coming in through our transit hubs in those locations. And also we know that people want more outdoor space. Workers want more outdoor space to do business, to have meetings, to have networking, those interactions. The more capital improvements and beautiful streetscapes, it encourages all of that. Third, under this umbrella, we also need to improve our quality of life issues. We, in this one, talk both about sort of sustainability, like reducing emissions and other polluting sources, Local Law 97, and other retrofit commissioning in order to make buildings more sustainable. But this is also sort of your typical clean and safe quality of life, get the garbage bags off the streets, get the sidewalk beds down, just common sense stuff that we in New York have become too used to just living with, but are frankly unacceptable, and this is the moment in time for us to do something about that. And then fourth, under this umbrella, we want to make sure that that we have this long-term view on making these 24/7 business districts, but we also know that some of them need a shot in the arm in the short term. So this one is about bringing activations in the very short term, programming, arts events, and other things that really drive foot traffic now, especially on like a Monday and a Friday when people may not be otherwise come to the districts. Our second goal is about making it easier for New Yorkers to get to work. This one is both about improving our transportation infrastructure so people can get into our business districts, but at the same time acknowledging that people are going to want to work closer to home, and so also making investments in a 5-borough economic development plan that has workspaces and closer to home, and also other employment hubs, whether it's anchor institution-oriented, transportation anchor institution-oriented, because people are going to want to work in all 5 boroughs, and we should encourage that. What I really like about this one is that it really acknowledges that the future of work is hybrid, which is, I think, the first time maybe that the governor or the mayor actually acknowledged that. And it draws on the strengths of being able to work from anywhere, but also at the same time saying we just need to make it easier to get to work no matter where you are. And so under this, we have a number of different strategies around improving our subways, our trains, our bike infrastructure, reducing cars and truck congestion so we can make which is a requirement for a number of our other recommendations, and then also investing in these 5-borough employment hubs. Our third and last goal is about generating inclusive, future-focused growth. This one is about supporting jobs and innovation, but also breaking down barriers to economic mobility. It's about diversifying our economy to make sure that we are more resilient to future shocks, while also making sure that we're investing in future-focused sectors like climate adaptation, green economy, offshore wind, life science. And this one is also about acknowledging that we need to confront our housing crisis head on. This was one of the most interesting moments for me during our entire panel process. I think it was the very first meeting, a tech leader stood up and said, if we're not talking about our housing affordability crisis, what are we even doing here? If companies cannot reliably house their people here, it doesn't matter what else we do. No companies are going to want to come here because they need their employees to be stably housed. And so the housing piece, even though maybe it seems a little bit different from where we started with our business district recovery, is really a core piece and is actually a huge part of the governor's legislative agenda this year. And then last but not least, under this goal, is about ensuring that access to opportunity is fair and equitable. So this one's about removing barriers to labor force participation, such as making sure that childcare is more accessible, higher quality and more affordable. This one is also about making sure, for example, that people with disabilities don't have to make a trade-off between keeping their home health aid on Medicaid and entering the workforce. So we're trying a legislative fix around that. This one's also about making sure that workforce development is aligned with real industry needs of the future and making sure that BIPOC entrepreneurs and MWB businesses have better access to opportunity. So it's a lot, it's 40 points. I'm happy to, in Q&A, get into any of them, but I just wanted to sort of give an overview of the strategic framework around it. And then the last thing I'll say is we've really hit the ground running in implementation since it started in December. The New York priorities were well represented in the governor's State of the State address and in her executive budget. Fingers crossed that the politics play out in our favor and we actually get a lot of those through at the end of that process. We also were excited to see the mayor lift up a lot of these priorities in his State of the City a few weeks ago, including a $375 million investment in some of those public realm capital improvements that I was talking about, a really important down payment so that private sector knows that we are serious about making our streets more livable. We're also, of course, going to need a broad coalition of leaders and organizations and everyday New Yorkers to lift this up. A lot of these, as you hear me talking, probably sound like very common sense changes, but yet they have many political hurdles. So we are looking, for folks for whom this stuff resonates to make their voices heard with their legislators through the political process, with their friends, because we really are going to need sort of to get arm in arm to come together for the recovery of our city so that we aren't in a doom spiral. And I'm happy to take more questions during our discussion.
Thank you, Julie. Much more positive than my colleague here. So, with a lot of potential, private sector. I mean, what I find interesting as well, like private initiatives. Maybe ideas that people have. So let me open it up. I mean, I could go back to all of you, but let's open it up and take some questions from you all for either one of the three. Or all of them at the same time. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you again. So you kind of mentioned, Julie, about taking away a lot of the regulations and pieces to make things businesses come back. But are we making changes in taxes? Because how do you make the tax situations, corporate taxes in Florida are so much lower, right? That's a huge incentive to go to these other southern states. And then, So what are we doing?
Yeah, we didn't make any specific recommendations around business taxes, for example. There certainly are certain development property taxes and things that encourage some of the development that we want to see, especially around housing, 421A and whatnot. I mean, I think, the article that you quoted in the beginning about the plan, all it talks about, cities are for people who want to be there, and I think that's kind of true. It's is the juice worth the squeeze? Sure, some businesses are going to move their business because for them it makes sense. New York City's got a competitive advantage. It has a number of competitive advantages, including our talent. So we did not address corporate taxes head on. I think, we think that this package is the right one for this moment.
Sorry.
Can I say something about that? So just to sort of follow up, I mean, I very much admire the plan that New York City put together and sort of in an analysis comparing to different cities. New York City is sort of on the vanguard of having sort of the most coherent response of any major city in the United States. So I applaud them for that. So my overarching question, though, after reading this report, which is similar to yours, which is sort of how much is all of that going to cost, and where is the money going to come from, right? And so that's sort of ultimately a question of taxes, because if property values indeed fall by 40%, then you can do the math. That's $5 billion. It's a $5 billion hit on a $100 billion budget. So that's a 5% budget deficit just from the commercial property tax reduction. And so the question is, which other taxes are going to go up, or which spending is going to get cut in order to make up the difference? Because cities have a balanced budget requirement, right? And so that's sort of related to your question. Are residential property taxes going to go up? Well, that's not going to be very popular. We're sort of coming up on an election. I would be surprised if we're going to raise residential property taxes. But the math has to add up.
Sorry, and the part two to my question that I forgot for a second, real quick, is development regulation. So like, are we changing, all of these conversions, everything, like New York City takes a long time to do development here. Those some of the regulations that are gonna change?
I mean, that's the hope. So someone before we started was asking how difficult is it politically to do it, and the answer is somewhat, and it depends where. I do think that the political winds are shifting, especially around a lot of the housing pieces of this. I think, I don't know that it's just the way my Twitter feed is curated, but maybe. But it does feel like we're in a groundswell moment, right? It feels like there is a thing that used to be very politically difficult to say about bringing on more housing and bringing more people in. People are willing to dive into those development politics a little bit differently than they were. But sure, I mean, you're going to have your state changes that are going to be made, followed by the city changes that are going to be made followed by the business that's going to need to happen, and then the development process. So this is not a short-term fix, right? This is a near medium-term fix. Best case scenario, someone already has the project lined up, but that's not going to be the case. Which is why we're looking at other things in the shorter term to sort of to bring on those changes. But yeah, you're right. I mean, this is about the evolution of the city towards a future that we want to see, and an optimism that we want to get there. It can't only be the development is never going to solve our problem, and always has a lag time. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that, but
Yeah, well, I have a question. Like, how easy is it to convert? Like Nick and Stein, like this conversion. How many can we convert? How easy is it? How expensive is it going to be?
So just briefly to comment on the prior topic, New York is a difficult place to build. We've been doing it for years. We've been doing adaptive reuse, conversions. We've done ground-up development, and it's difficult, but it's also one of the biggest and most attractive markets in the country. So, there's a tension between if you can put in place the infrastructure and the expertise to be able to build in New York, boy, you can do some exciting projects. So, and one other thing I would touch on that we talk about New York relative to other cities, business diversity. San Francisco is kind of a one-trick town, right? And so it's worse than what you said. It's 25% vacant, but another 20% is on the sublet market. 45% of the city of San Francisco is available for rent because it's a one-trick town. It's all about the tech companies. New York is the most diverse business base of any major city in the United States. I mean, the tech's here, and we've got we've got the finance industry, and we've got professional services, and we've got advertising, and we've got media, and we've got you name it. So I think that helps us as we come out because you can kick sort of one leg from the stool, and others are still in good shape. Going to the second question, kind of the residential conversion, it would be terrific and be great for the city if we converted some of these old buildings to residential uses, and we will, but it's not something that can be done easily on a large scale. So just to walk through some of the issues, you look at 10 different office buildings, maybe 1 out of 10 just can be converted to residential because you've got to have the right floor plate, and you've got to have the right fenestration. It has to be in the right location. So just the physical aspect, the floor, ceiling height, access egress. So if you just look at 10 buildings, maybe 1 or 2 are suitable, all things being equal, for conversion. Then if you look at the math, just simple math, for cost to revenue and expense. So if you start from the revenue side, my little cheat sheet. So if at the end of the process, after you've converted the building, if you're lucky, you'll get $90 per square foot for the rent. and you'll have approximately $30 a square foot in expenses, so you're gonna net $60 a foot. And again, that's including real estate taxes. If you're lucky, it'll be valued at a 5 cap at the end of that, and you'll have a building that's worth $1,200 per square foot. But you won't, because actually there's a loss factor. If you convert the building, as an office building, you lease 100% of the space. As a residential building, you lose about 15 to 20% of the space when you convert. So your leasable space is about 85% of the gross. So your $1,200 a foot converts to a little over $1,000 a foot. That's what your building is worth if you're successful at the end of the process, and it's going to take you 4 years. It's going to take you 4 years because it's a year to plan, at least 2.5 years to convert, and then a year to stabilize. So a 4-year project from start to finish. This is among the most risky things you can do in my business. You're buying a vacant building, maybe it's vacant, maybe it's not, that's a separate issue, but you're hopefully buying a vacant building, and then you're spending years of, God knows how much risk capital to convert it, and then eventually you're hoping it's gonna lease up at the end of that process. So that's at least 25% money, maybe more, but so if it's gonna be worth $1,000 a foot at the end of the day, in order to get a 25% return, if you do the math, you have to be all in at maybe $600 a foot, a little bit above that, in order to get a 25% return on your equity, which is probably gonna be 35% of your total capitalization, right? So that's the revenue side. You need to be in at $600 a foot. So what does it cost? Average conversion costs between $200 and $400 per square foot of hard costs, right? Let's pick 300 in the middle. Then it costs another 200 in soft costs, especially with interest carry being twice as much as what it used to be. So the conversion costs of the average building are probably $500 a foot. You have to be all in at roughly $600 a foot. You have to buy the building for $100 per square foot. Aren't that many buildings that are for sale for $100 a square foot, right? And you also have to buy it vacant. Very, very few buildings are entirely vacant. It actually costs money to vacate a building, and that leads to uncertainty in the process. So in order to make the numbers work, now, every building's different. Maybe the conversion costs a little bit different. Maybe some you are in incredible locations and you'll get more than $90 a foot. So there are characteristics about individual properties that can change those numbers, but that's kind of an average, and that's why the numbers don't work in most cases. In most cases, you almost have to be given the building in order to make the numbers work.
I think it's just like the scale of what's actually anticipated to potentially happen is very small. I mean, this is, in the throes of the pandemic, it seemed like such a no-brainer. Oh, of course you should do this. But when you actually, so the city just completed what was called the Office Adaptive Reuse Task Force, which made recommendations for actually how to make it easier to do this on the regulatory side. And of all of the sort of like common sense changes that they want to make that are actually up for consideration right now, it only brings about 250 additional buildings into the realm of possibility for conversion. It only anticipates there's like 20,000, like generously, 20,000 units convert over the next 10 years. So we're really talking about a niche market for this.
And look, incentives make a difference. I mean, if the city or state come up with incentives, that could be very helpful in converting.
I think what's really exciting about this conversion is potentially with the opportunity of some incentive for affordable housing to actually get affordable housing in business district locations where actually there's very little opportunity to otherwise have it. And I think that's sort of like the key opportunity is not just housing, but income restricted affordable housing in areas where it's otherwise difficult to bring it on.
I mean, I hate to be the party pooper here, but if it's already not feasible with market rent housing, how will it be feasible with affordable housing? I'm all for affordable housing. I've done a lot of research in affordable housing. I'm the biggest affordable housing fan, but it's not economically feasible for market rents. Or the subsidies would have to be absolutely enormous. It sort of gets us back to the question of where is the money going to come from, and I think that's sort of and to Nick's point, I mean, Nick is absolutely right. I mean, the obstacles are sort of tremendous. There's physical limitations. There's economic limitations. There's regulatory barriers, and sort of this conversion is not a new idea. I mean, just yesterday or today, a big new conversion opened up in New York City, One Wall Street. Macklowe did One Wall Street. They started 5 or 6 years ago, long before COVID. It took 5 or 6 years to Nick's point, and he did it successfully, but it's all ultra luxury rentals, as you might imagine, condos and rentals, and it's certainly not affordable housing. And I don't know what the economics of that building will look like. Right? If you look at the numbers, over the last 7 years, 1% of the office stock has been converted to apartments, 1%. And if we're very lucky, we can convert another 1% in the next 3 to 4 years. That's sort of the numbers we're talking about here. Right? So this is not a panacea to the problem. I agree. That's sort of the direction we need to go. We need to sort of make New York City a place where people want to live, not necessarily where people want to work. And that will require conversion or creation of new apartments. But office to apartment conversion is complicated.
At the same time, we are also trying to pursue the lifting of what's called the 12 floor area ratio cap, which would allow denser residential development in areas where it's appropriate. And this is an opportunity to fundamentally change the economics of redevelopment by adding value and giving more value for developers. And so we think, of course, the conversions are one path, but for an outdated office building, having another tool in your toolkit of redevelopment where it makes it easier to pencil is another opportunity we think sort of goes hand in hand.
To me, that's a tremendous opportunity that the city has. At zero cost, right? The city, with a stroke of a pen, can change zoning laws and can allow taller, denser buildings in and around. Now, I'm saying, it's not so easy. I know there's community, there's process, all that, but just in theory, that by allowing greater density of development and a broader latitude of use groups in particular locations in and around major transportation, I think that's the kind of thing that could really be innovative and could spur construction.
And this is like a very little known fact that the state actually controls how much residential density we can build, and it limits it to 12 FAR. Wow. So the state does not have any control over the density of any other use type except for residential development in New York City. And so it's capped at 12. It's in front of the it's in the governor's budget this year to lift that. It was last year as well. There's a stronger coalition coming back for it. But we would still need to make changes at the local level in order to enact that local zoning change. But we have this additional hurdle at the state level that we're hopefully going for this year.
Another little change, but this may be a much smaller magnitude, is a developer friend of mine was telling me that he was converting an office to residential in Washington, D.C. And sort of New York City has a law that if it's a bedroom, it must have a window. That turns out to be a law, as far as I know, only in New York City. In D.C., that's not the case, for example. So, he
it's
could...
not only in New York City,
but
in D.C. and Philly both don't have it. I just read that the other day.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So there are places that do not have that rule. So what can you do if the bedroom does not need to have a window? Well, you could build the bedroom in the interior of the building, which sort of dramatically reduces your loss factor. And you can build a nice big bedroom with a big closet, and it turns out, people love these types of apartments, and he did very, very well on that development. So small things like that, that's sort of with a stroke of a pen, this could be changed, and it would make some conversions sort of feasible that otherwise would not be feasible.
In the developer process, that's called a home office.
The home office. Exactly. Home office.
I have the shades down in my bedroom all the time.
There you go. You don't need a window.
So let's take some more questions.
So one thing, I haven't read the 40-point plan, but one thing New York has led in, and one of the reasons that I came to live in New York, is the focus on sustainability. Local Law 97, regardless of how it plays out with how much fine and all of that people see, where do you see that effect in office development, workplace development? Reading recently that one Vanderbilt is already behind, right? Because it has so many gas-fired appliances and the move to electrify. How do you see that coming into where we're headed in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting. I can't remember which one of you mentioned this, but talking about on the flip side of that, when the buildings can't meet it, how it further sort of it brings the lower quality buildings behind. I think the flip side of that is exactly right. Tenants, and maybe you can speak to this, are want to be in the best buildings, and that is about especially coming out of the pandemic, the best air quality, the best sustainability. They want the amenities and the features that they expect. I think us also recognize that there are certain challenges to achieving Local Law 97, and so one of the things we're looking at is whether there's a way to sort of do innovative financing through some consortium, public-private consortium, in order to get people where they need to be. But we think it's sort of part and parcel with this quality of life concept, which is that, in order for these to be the best buildings that are gonna, attract people back into the office, you gotta be right with sort of like state of the art on that side. I don't know how you.
Yeah, because sustainability isn't only about energy production, right? ESG has got many facets to it, so yeah, curious at that point.
So I would kind of say incredible change in the business in the last 10 years. I would say 10 years ago, people didn't pay a lot of attention to, very few firms paid a lot of attention to sustainability issues. And we've seen year by year it become more important, more and more important on almost every side. And I'll start from our investor base. We raise money from pension funds and insurance companies, raise money from European pension funds, which was where kind of the initial, with APG is a Dutch pension fund, major investor of ours. Starting about maybe 10, 11 years ago, they started requiring us as part of their investment in our limited partnership agreement to track sustainability metrics across our portfolio. And GRESB, the Global Real Estate Benchmarking System, is kind of the measurement system that most institutional investors use. And it's scored out of 100. I think we were a 30 the first year, which is not, by the way, it's not a good score. But every single year, what we've found is as we raise capital for funds, it's more and more important to more and more investors that we not only are able to show improvements across our GRESB scores, but that we have policies and procedures in place to address sustainability issues on every asset that we acquire. And so so that's coming from the investor base, and it's coming from municipalities. Local Law 97, Boston passed a recent law. Those are sort of cutting edge laws that are requiring, carbon testing across buildings. Little known fact, buildings are responsible for about 40% of the world's carbon production. Like it's on par with, people think about cars, buildings are almost as big. So we're seeing it across our portfolio in New York, where we're addressing issues to make sure we can hit the benchmarks required as the thresholds go up over time for local law 97 testing on carbon reduction. And then tenants, tenants, I would say still smaller tenants, not so focused, but larger, more institutional tenants want to go to the best buildings with the best policies and procedures that are LEED certified. So again, we're seeing it from almost every aspect of the business. And while 10 or 12 years ago it was lip service, this is not lip service. This is very, very focused sort of kind of investment policies that are implemented across our portfolio and across the portfolios of most institutional investors now.
Yeah, no, I think this is very important. The climate focus that you're talking about. That sort of, to me, raises an interesting possibility of sort of back to our prior discussion on conversion, and sort of the lack of funding and sort of the gap that Nick was talking about in the funding. You could imagine a plan that converts brown Class B office buildings into green Class A apartment buildings, and use federal funding to help with that, right? So, for example, the EPA has a $27 billion fund that was passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act last year. Much of that money is sort of not earmarked, and there's sort of this public, process right now for proposals. Sort of one proposal is, explicitly allow for that money to be used for these type of conversions, right? And so now you sort of have, we're taking an office building of the market, we're creating housing, and we're helping the environment. It's sort of a win-win-win. Optimistic note.
And for the first time, all three of you are positive.
Yeah.
By the way, our most recent score was a 92. So we came up the curve, but it took 10 years.
Excuse me. How has the capital raising landscape changed in the past couple of years, especially with respect to office space? Like, what are you hearing from your investor base about the plans going forward? And then where ultimately do you see maybe new capital sources coming from that are still interested and see the value in sort of flight to quality?
So I think in general, it's been a very, very difficult landscape to raise capital in. Look, Blackstone can always raise money, but I think a lot of the secondary, and we're in that secondary category, it's been a hard environment to raise money. We're about to launch Savannah Fund 6, but it is a distress-oriented vehicle, a high-yield distress-oriented vehicle that I think is going to really focus on kind of rescue capital in and around the tri-state area, New York City and the tri-state area. And we're getting I would say, a much warmer reception for that particular strategy. But I would say, in general, there's been so much uncertainty around the office space in particular over the last couple of years that it's been hard to raise money for office-focused investments.
The only place I've seen some investors mention at least an interest in the survey and investing in offices in Asia. I think in Asia, sort of people live even in smaller places, sort of the office culture is stronger. So maybe that's sort of the only exception. But I think in general, US and European investors want to stay far away from office.
So then how do ultimately the institutional quality office assets in this country trade? I mean, what's going to happen to the price of them if and when the owners at some point want liquidity in the next few years if nobody on the planet wants to buy office in America?
So I'll start and other people can add. And I would say, I think I would have used a 20% figure. I don't think I would have used a 40% figure. I would have said office values are kind of off 20%. But it's almost impossible to do any kind of a transaction in the current environment because the capital markets are upside down. So if you own a portfolio, if you can avoid it, you are absolutely not selling anything right now. You're trying to hold through this period till capital markets stabilize, ideally maybe till interest rates come down, and you're into a more healthy, robust transactional environment. But right now, pricing is opaque. There are so few transactions that it's not clear what kind of deal you can execute. And just briefly, I think where I think a lot of capital is going to be deployed in the next 2 years, again, when I say rescue capital, a very quick example. If you owned a really good office building in the heart of Manhattan a year ago and it had a $5 million net income, you would have capped that at a 4.5, and your building would have been worth $110 million, right? And if you had 65% debt, which is kind of normal, you would have been carrying about $70 million of debt on that building. And at that time, you were paying 3 or 4% interest. If your debt is coming due today, same building, great building, fully occupied with great tenants on long-term leases. If your debt is coming due today, and your lender says, pay me the $70 million that you owe on this building, and you say, okay, I'm going to go, I have a great building, it's fully occupied, I'm going to go refinance, very hard to get a quote. Right? This is a terrific building in the heart of Manhattan, and if you get a quote, that $5 million, they're going to apply a 1.25 debt service coverage ratio to it, so you can have $4 million of financeable income. And then they're going to price that to a minimum 8% debt yield. That gives you $50 million. You owe the other guy 70, and the market is saying, here's 50. So the differential is rescue capital, right? That's where the biggest opportunity is in the market today, because you got to, if you have that building and you got to pay, you have 3 options. One is you give the building back to your lender. 2 is you come up with $20 million to fill that gap. Not a lot of people have $20 million sitting around in a bank account to just own the same building tomorrow that they owned yesterday. And the third is you go to the market and you say, somebody give me this money, I need it, I'll keep some equity interest on the back end, I'll keep a hope note, and that money is priced at about 20% today. So that's kind of the opportunity right now. But to your point, I think if anyone can avoid selling a building right now, no one's selling a building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, hot off the press today, Vornado just gave back 650 Madison Avenue, I have it printed here, $1.2 billion valuation for this building in 2019, $800 million of debt on it. They just gave back the keys. So basically the $400 million equity is wiped out. And that's sort of...
That's a good building on Fifth Avenue.
That's a good building on Madison Avenue, and that's Vornado. Vornado does A+ in New York City. They're a very sophisticated landlord, and it's not an isolated example. RXR, Nick mentioned it, Brookfield just gave back sort of a portfolio of Class A buildings. And that's the good stuff. Office REITs are trading down 50%, 50. Again, that's the A+ stuff, right? So, these are not, I think 20% valuation decline is very optimistic in light of this evidence. I agree with a 20-25% number for A+, but I think if you look at everything else, B and C is much, much worse.
Just to follow up with what you were just mentioning, I understand that right now nobody's selling anything because they're not getting what they would expect. But do you think that we're going to reach a point in the midterm or sooner than later that people will be obliged to sell?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's what I mean by a default cycle. I think we're going into a default cycle, and when you say give back, all of these are situations where owners are giving their properties back to the lenders, and they're saying, you take it. The lender's gonna force it onto the market. The lender's gonna do a forced sale. And the market it'll clear at a clearing price.
When will you think this could
It's
happen?
happening right now. And it's just gonna accelerate over the course of the year.
I mean, usually happens at the time of refinancing. So a lot of debt is 10-year fixed. So a lot of the stuff that was issued in 2013 is now coming due. And sort of the calculation is what's sort of your equity in the building at that point. And that depends on the relative interest rate that you had back in 2013 versus the interest rate that you're getting now. And sort of the numbers that Nick just walked through is like perfect example of, sort of the extra money you need to put into the building in order to refinance it.
In the next, that's the fixed rate stuff that's longer term. In the next 12 months, $15 billion of CMBS is coming due in New York City. And then if you add balance sheet lending, it's probably more than twice that. Yeah. So, $30, $40 billion of debt is coming due over the next year in the city. And every single maturity will have a massive shortfall compared to what the market will bear today.
You two both talked about a variety of opportunities and scenarios in which public and private partnerships are at play. What would you say are maybe the lowest hanging fruit for public-private partnerships, and then looking kind of further afield at broader kind of systems change plays that would inevitably need to happen? What's your point of view on that?
So we've been getting a lot of phone calls from folks that are really interested in what's called like lighter, faster, cheaper public realm improvements. And so just one example, we were talking about how long it takes to build anything in New York City. We are focused on getting a bunch of capital improvements in the street, permanent, signals that the city is improving. But also there's opportunities for private landlords who have public space on their sidewalks, for example, to just throw up stuff like tactical urbanism, right? There's opportunities to do stuff that isn't necessarily a capital improvement. It falls short of like in the grand capital improvement is on private property that's public facing, but that has a sort of like the same type of impact on the public realm. And so, I mean, I know that's like a small example, I think, in the scale of what you're talking about, but I think that there's a huge opportunity there to really like one of the things that we are seeking is, unique in-person experiences, right? For residents, for office workers, for visitors, for tourists, right? We want to have a reason to be in these places, driving foot traffic, driving retail sales, and driving that vibrancy that you seek. And so anything that sort of like is of interest, it changes that streetscape environment. So I think that that's sort of like very simple tactical stuff. It's hard for the city to do, easy for private sector to do, but with a public face. And we often find that, that's sort of true maybe with pop-ups, right? Like a pop-up at a retail store, et cetera, et cetera. You really kind of need a private sector partner that is more invested in the neighborhood and not just necessarily in a single storefront. Like you see the people who do the most creative things. Like every pop-up lease that you do takes as long as a lease that you would do for any retail space, right? Like it's sort of a labor of love. And so you see people doing that who have more of like a neighborhood view. And so you look for those private partners to do that type of thing. I think that's one example. Another sort of like interesting system change thing that I haven't talked about yet is, I don't know if anyone wants to talk about curb management, but this is one of the things that I'm particularly excited about the potential for. The idea that basically rather than having, all of our parking spots dedicated just for car parking and oftentimes free car parking, what if we actually changed it to a modular, dynamically priced use and pricing system where you could actually sort of slot in a modular, like a street eatery or a loading zone or a car park, and like that stuff changes over the course of the day. That stuff changes, based on demand for pricing. Like there's a real opportunity for us to use our streets and to partner with users in the private sector to like better activate I can't remember the number. It's like 75% of our like public right of way is dedicated to car parking, which is like insane. And I think that there's like it's maybe not the sexiest thing, but from where I sit, it just could be so transformational in terms of our experience. And also, the type of use, I think the pandemic really opened our eyes to how we could use the street differently, whether it's open streets or whether it's open restaurants. And I think curb management sort of takes that to the next level. It's like a very sexy thing in San Francisco, but hasn't quite hit New York, but we're hoping to pilot it here. And I think it could have like very tangible changes to people's experience, both sort of like in the activities that you do, but also your experience in the level home.
I mean, I think if you look at it in New York, some of the things the city, the High Line completely transformed the West Side. Unbelievable what that project did. And your example about Midtown lacking open space, like the most successful area of Midtown is Bryant Park. Bryant Park was activated, and it's incredible what that did for the entire surrounding community. So I think sort of infrastructural improvements like that the city can make are enormously helpful. And then, we've talked a lot about the conversions of housing. If there was some it's hard to make the numbers work, but incentives can help make the numbers work and could accelerate some of those conversions of defunct secondary office buildings.
I think the other crucial one is public transportation.
That's about to say.
That's New York City falls apart without the subway, and the subway has a $2.5 billion fiscal deficit per year for the foreseeable future. And so I think sort of passing the congestion tolls to fund that, I think, is sort of a crucial piece.
Yeah, it could be transformational both for the funding mechanisms, but also for actually our use of the streets.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we recommend in our report is what's called a city ticket, which is like a 24/7 city ticket. Right now, off peak, you can ride LIRR for $5, but at the peak, you still need to pay full price. But there's additional capacity on LIRR and Sue on Metro North as well, because people coming to the office and also they're bringing on additional capacity. And so we've done the math, if you reduce the price, there's actually a sweet spot where you get additional revenue because more people will ride it. And so we're just trying to think really creatively about using additional infrastructure that we actually already have, but in a way that meets the moment.
You mentioned like transformational. There's a lot of stuff on the news about potential like casinos with the license. Like, can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on that and maybe some of the qualitative effects of what will happen to the city if they were to put a casino in the city?
I don't know a lot about it. I'm kind of in favor of it. I kind of think it breathes life and business to critical central business districts, but I don't know. I think I don't know any more than what you've read in the paper.
Times Square already looks like a casino, doesn't it? Wouldn't really change the look of it.
What are your thoughts about shared spaces, offices like the WeWork business model? And if you think that the pandemic has affected that, how do you see it in the future?
I'll say something about it. I think sort of ironically, I think the business model, is going to get new life because, there's a lot of small firms out there that don't really need or want to or can afford like a long-term expensive lease. And especially, and that demand for sort of flexible leasing has, if anything, increased in the last few years with remote work and with hybrid work. So, that doesn't mean that WeWork will do well. I think that means that a flexible leasing will do well. Because the truth of the matter is, to use a quote from Warren Buffett, what's the moat, right? What is the moat that WeWork has? I always teach my real estate finance students this, like WeWork has no moat. Therefore, the business is not worth very much. And the reason is that every landlord, Nick can be WeWork tomorrow. And it's really not difficult.
In the pandemic, our goal was just to keep the buildings occupied. We were signing 6-month, 1-year leases just to keep the lights on.
And you can put in a coffee store or whatever, a ping pong table in your building, right? That doesn't require WeWork. And so I'm very skeptical about WeWork, but I'm very bullish on sort of flexible, adaptive leasing. And I think even going beyond that, I think there will be contractual innovations in sort of, we talked earlier about Nick's view, which I sort of am not a believer in. Nick's view is that we need the same space as we did before, because as long as my workers need to come in on Tuesday and Wednesday, I need the exact same square footage as if they're there every 5 days. I don't think that's true. I think what will happen in the future is landlords will get very creative and sort of leasing that space, with new contracts, with apps. If your small business wants to rent an office in Manhattan on Monday, it'll only cost a third as what it will cost on Tuesday. And guess what? If we can sort of make it work that you are there on Monday and I'm there on Tuesday, and we have an app for that, we'll figure it out. And so I think that too is that's good news for creative landlords that can use their building more efficiently. It's sort of very bad news for aggregate demand for office space, because we'll be using our buildings much more.
But it's also really exciting for potential for growth, because it actually means that we're not as constrained by our office buildings for the potential for additional business. And so if we can get our housing right, it creates a lot more, opportunity for.
True.
But by the way, I don't think that's true either. I think there's just going to be less demand. But I think many businesses will have that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday dynamic, but I think in the aggregate, you're right. There is going to be less demand.
Just one more question, maybe.
How are you guys thinking about replacement costs and the ongoing construction cost increases that are going on right now, and sort of how that gives existing assets pricing power?
So we're pretty far out in the supply chain bidding. And so I think what's interesting is sometimes we barely have particular insight into the future, but I think we're bidding out several large-scale projects right now. And while in the past 3 or 4 years, costs always were going up, I think we're seeing actually at the sort of back end of when we're bidding for, drywall contracts, elevator contracts, foundation, when we look out a year, 18 months, it feels like the cost curve is shifting back. So I think the effect of interest rates, inflation, all that, I kind of see it in our business sort of leveling out and maybe coming down a year to 18 months out. It's an interesting question about whether that gives just the general higher pricing of new construction gives an advantage to older buildings. I'm not sure. Probably the one asset class in New York City that is held up better than anything is new construction. People are paying a premium for new construction. And now in New York, part of it is it's so hard to add to the supply. It's so expensive and time consuming that when you build a brand new LEED certified, gold office building, it fills up, and it actually fills up for kind of record high prices. So I'm not sure I see the connection between a strong advantage for older buildings because of the increasing cost of building new ones.
I mean, there's basically no demand for new office buildings at this point. I mean, if you're in San Francisco, I don't know, are we ever going to see a new office building being built in San Francisco? Maybe, right? Maybe it'll be an A+ building, but there's basically a huge excess supply. So sort of the last thing we want to do right now is add new supply to the market. So that advantage, I think, is sort of not relevant right now, right? Because
but my point is in New York, One Vanderbilt, 425 Park, they're hitting $200 to $300 a square foot leases.
Sure, but those were all planned way before the
There's very little in the yes.
Yeah. So like who's starting new construction right now, right?
Right.
Okay, so thank you so much. That was really exciting. So I think my takeaway is it's very challenging, but also a lot of opportunities to, rethink and reimagining the future of cities, and where like private, companies, private solutions, interesting new solutions can also come in. But it's definitely going to be rough for maybe a couple of months or years to come. So thank you so much for coming. The storm has not hit us yet, maybe never. So it was worth showing up. Thanks so much for the panelists.